I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
And we are two Shakespeare nerds who decided to make a podcast about our love for Shakespeare.
In this podcast, we will tackle as many dimensions to Shakespeare's plays as we can by looking at the text, examining the historical context in which it was written, and how the text is viewed through modern lenses of feminism, racism, classism, colonialism, nationalism, ableism, all of the isms.
We will discuss how his plays shaped both the past and present, and, as actors, how his plays can be responsibly performed today.
All while trying our best to approach his works without giving in to bardolatry. So, Shakespeare Anyone? Hi, listeners. Elyse here to remind you of all the ways you can support the podcast and the work that Kourtney and I do. First up, we have a Patreon. Our Patreon patrons receive exclusive bonus content. Every month, we do a roundup of Shakespeare-related content we have found online. We also share Patreon-exclusive bonus episodes of the podcast. These look like extended versions of episodes you've heard here, collaborations with other Shakespeare podcasters, and Kourtney and I doing reviews of Shakespeare-adjacent media, like TV shows, movies, and books that are inspired by or loosely based on Shakespeare and Shakespeare plays. Patreon patrons also receive snail mail from the podcast, and some levels even vote on future episodes of our podcast. If you are interested in checking out our Patreon, or just the Shakespeare-related names we've given the tiers of support, head to patreon.com/Shakespeare Anyone. The link is also in our episode description. After you've done that, please rate, review, and follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Your review might even make it on an episode. You can also follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and tell a friend. Word of mouth is our best form of advertising. Thank you so much for all of the support you give the podcast. Now, on to the episode.
Hi, Kourtney. We stared at each other and went, who's going first? And we said it at the same time.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Like our last episode that we launched, it's still a heat wave here in Los Angeles, so it is warm, but things are going really well. I actually just selected the next classes I'll be taking for my Shakespeare degree. I don't talk about it much on the podcast, but I've selected some new courses, and we talked outside of recording off record about it. And so I'm just really excited about all the Shakespeare that's coming back into my life as the end of summer and the beginning of the school year starts up. What about you?
I'm doing pretty well. But yeah, also outside of the podcast, I've had a lot of Shakespeare going on in my life. I went to Ashland, Oregon last month and saw a local production of Julius Caesar recently, and I have been in rehearsals for a production of Twelfth Night, and my production of Twelfth Night has opened. By the time this episode's out, I believe we'll be heading into our closing weekend. Yes.
But you're having a hot Shakespeare summer.
Having a hot Shakespeare summer. And yeah, we had a great conversation over on our Instagram a couple weeks ago with followers about like what Shakespeare they're seeing. So it sounds like it's a bit of a hot Shakespeare summer for many people.
Yeah. I love it.
Yeah. So today's episode, what are we talking about, Kourtney?
Yeah, today we are talking about Shakespeare's comic constables. And so that would be Dogberry. And of course, he has assistants in the form of Verges.
The Watch.
The Watch. So we're talking about this particular role in Shakespearean society and what it was and how Shakespeare uses it, and really diving into the character of Dogberry.
Yeah, because we get this kind of rustic fool throughout, or this magistrate. There's also a justice of the peace, for example, in Henry IV, I think part 2, who, is also kind of made the butt of a joke. Focusing on constables, because we are talking about Much Ado About Nothing, what was this position in early modern society? And were they as ineffective as Dogberry is? So I'm going to start off by attempting to answer that question of, were they as ineffective, and what did this job entail? My reading for this episode consisted of Joan Kent's The English Village Constable, 1580 to 1642, The Nature and Dilemmas of the Office. And this was a study based on village records, as well as those of the county and the central government, primarily within 9 villages. Those were Salwarp, Worcestershire, Paddingham, Staffordshire, Branston, Melton Mowbray, Waltham on the Wolds, Leicestershire, Bushy and Little Munden, Hertfordshire, and Gissing and Shelton in Norfolk. And Kent notes that she chose these because, one, they have documents for 1580 to 1642, and also some geographical diversity between the villages. And there was also supplemental material from other villages within the same counties to support this, and looking at all sorts of records of these localities to figure out what were these constables doing, and was that real? Were comic constables a real thing? So Kent notes that comic constables that align with Dogberry and other early modern comic constables from the plays can be found in these historical records. However, the occurrences of, quote, ignorance, stupidity, and even laziness compared to their busy round of duties within the village and of their many journeys to neighboring villages or the county town to answer the summons of higher officials makes it difficult to accept that they were normally either dilatory or willfully disobedient, unquote. Instead, Kent notes that the position had heavy demands and that the extent that they were attempting to fulfill these demands is way more evident in the actual historical record than any sort of notes of lack of responsibility or failing in their efforts. And so to go a little bit backwards in time and talk about first the origin of what a constable was. Originally, the role of the constable was an officer of the village, tithing, or township, and was also known as a tithing man, headborough, borseholder, or even reeve, and was similar to a village leader in other parts of Europe or in non-Western societies. And we want to take a moment right now and point out that, therefore, these constables, even though during this time they are doing legal work and serve in an executive office where they are doing policing activities for their community, they are not related to modern police forces or the history of modern police forces, specifically with regards to American police forces. Instead, as England transitioned from a country made up of communities that were largely self-governing to consolidating power within the monarchy over centuries and centuries, the expansion of the royal government, especially during the medieval and early modern periods, led to these village chiefs becoming subordinated to higher authorities, and in many cases, thus led to a new title of constable. Kent notes that, quote, while retaining their earlier functions as leaders and representatives of local communities, they also acquired new royal duties, as did headmen in non-Western societies who became agents of colonial powers during the 19th and 20th centuries, unquote. So they are much more similar to a local government official than, as I mentioned earlier, modern American police forces. And the historical record also does not support the idea that constables' weaknesses or lack of ability to do their jobs was due to personal or social deficiencies. They also do not support the idea that kind of Shakespeare and playwriters of the early modern era put forward in their characterizations of these characters that, quote, constables were usually chosen from among the meaner sort, while the more prosperous inhabitants escaped office by hiring substitutes, unquote. While that was largely believed by historians for a while, the historical record does not actually show that. These officials were most often chosen from families whose positions were just below the rank of gentlemen. For example, in Paddingham, Staffordshire, among the 81 constables who held office between 1583 and 1642, 63 of them were large or middle-sized farmers when compared to their community standards, and 9 men were craftsmen or tradesmen. These same men also filled other local offices, such as church warden, or were parish or manor leaders and served in other official capacities outside of their service as the constable.
So this is in some way similar to John Shakespeare being a bailiff, but he also is a glove maker.
Yes, exactly. Like John Shakespeare, they are members of their local community who have risen in prominence and are taking on an official duty within the local government. For some more examples of these other offices and how frequent it was, over half of Paddingham constables also served as church wardens at some point,
and over half can also be found on documents that authorize actions on behalf of the manor or the parish, so agreements that the entire manor or parish or township community is going to agree to do something. They are signatories on it. And at least 62 of them served on a jury at least once, and 34 were jury regulars. So they're more just like very involved community members.
Mm-hmm.
It is true, however, one thing that is commonly known about constables is that a criminal record does not bar a member of the community from becoming constable. And that is true. So they could have gotten into trouble with the law prior to becoming constables. They were a dual role that required the office holder to act in two different capacities. First, it's the lowest officer in the ladder of authority that reaches all the way up to the monarch. Again, they got their authority through the expansion of royal powers and the consolidation of power under the monarch.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, they're bound to serve the crown and other higher-ranking officials. So they represent the state to the parish and are responsible for making sure that the state's laws are followed within the parish. They also represent the village's interests to their superiors. Therefore, the office was often prone to being a focus of conflict when the state and the village did not align in their interests. And that is kind of the lead reason for them being seen as potentially ineffective, or for our early modern playwrights to paint them as ineffective or bumbling, is that they were caught between conflicting pressures and couldn't make really anyone happy. In 1626, a Surrey constable wrote a ballad, and in that ballad, he writes of the position, quote, "The justices will set us by the heels if we do not as we should, which, if we perform, the townsmen will storm, some of them hang us if they could," unquote.
Mm-hmm. So they're stuck in between a rock and a hard place.
Yes, exactly. And so some of their responsibilities and powers, they were, of course, as I mentioned earlier, they represent the township in negotiations with higher authorities, especially around taxes. And then they were also responsible to the Lords Lieutenant and justices in their capacity as commissioners of the musters. The constable maintained common armor and upkeep of the shooting butts. This is a time where a town would have an armory and all of their armor and weaponry would be kept centrally. So if people were called to muster, they were responsible for getting the community to get mustered and also making sure that they were ready.
Mm-hmm.
Constables had the power to call upon neighbors to keep watch, pursue the hue and cry, and assist him in making arrests. And most local functions varied from township to township, and some townships had church wardens who took on some of the same responsibilities. But some of the responsibilities within the town included custody of the communal bull, maintenance of village gates, waterings, weirds, sheep dams, hedges, and the pinfold, fetching slips or shoots for planting, trenching and sowing fields and thatching the herdsman's house, guarding crops from village animals, deer and crows, and the eradication of vermin. So they're really like also a maintenance man.
Yeah, it sounds like that's a job that should be allocated to another individual in the community.
Right. Sounds like it should be two jobs. And that's the thing that Kent keeps bringing up is like they're ineffective because maybe they had too many responsibilities.
Yeah.
And so again, they couldn't keep anybody happy because if they're doing well at one thing, they're going to inevitably not do well at another thing.
Yeah.
Or not prioritize another thing.
Yeah.
Even through the 17th century, constables were not appointed by central government or by administrative superiors. The local community would appoint constables. In fact, in 1612, a judicial case was tried in Stepney, which ruled against some justices who removed a constable and appointed a new officer. The judges in that case declared that while the justices could appoint and remove high constables, which are a higher rank than constable, they had no power or authority over petty constables. The office itself was often for 1 year, with selections occurring at Michaelmas or Easter. Some villages would have 2 constables that had staggered 2-year terms. So they were still selecting somebody for this role every year, but your term would be for 2 years. Procedures for appointment and which population of villagers were eligible to serve varied from village to village, and often kind of really depended on whether or not this medieval petty crime criminal court, overseen by a lord, which is known as a Court's Leet, and I'm about to refer to a couple times, were still meeting. So, quote, where Court's Leet continued to meet, constables were normally selected there, sometimes chosen by those owing suit to the court or the jury from among those eligible for the post, while in other cases the office followed a regular rotation among certain houses in the village, and the leet merely confirmed the position of the man whose turn it was to serve. Occasionally, the incumbent proposed several names and his successor was selected from among them. In a few instances, a particular property holder or steward of the court seems to have enjoyed the right to choose a constable. In manors where leets had ceased to meet, the inhabitants of the village sometimes assembled for the specific purpose of choosing a constable, and in some cases they were ordered to do so by the justices. In other instances, it was the parish vestry that fell heir to the leet's powers to choose a constable, though this body had no legal right to appoint him, and he was not, strictly speaking, an officer of the parish. Sometimes he appears to have been nominated in the vestry, even though he was formally confirmed in office in the court leet. Unquote. So there were a variety of places where, again, depending on the local custom and whether or not their leet court was still functioning, where the constable could be chosen. And one found on like the parish part, while the constable was not an officer of the parish, contemporaries often don't make a distinction between the parish and the locality, the township or village where the constable is overseeing, even when the two are not the same, even when sometimes a parish covers two townships and the constable would only technically be the town or the village's constable, they would still be referred to as a parish constable.
Okay.
In 1662, an act of parliament authorized justices to fill the office in the event that a leet had not been held or if the incumbent died or moved away. Some historians argue that this didn't really lead to any real change because justices had been appointing constables for a while already. At least as early as 1630, there's indication that justices had started to push for more of a voice in the selection of constables and denied the validity of local customs that dictated eligibility. Many of these justices were also large landowners and lords of leets, and they may have been already involved in selecting the constable due to these other capacities that they would have been acting in. But there's little evidence in the records of this, and this would have been, quote, very much at odds with the respect for village customs that they displayed as magistrates, unquote, for these justices to be appointing constables on their own prior to this act of parliament.
So as the early modern era progresses, as England becomes more centralized through the monarchy and parliament, the like local custom of electing starts to be stripped away from the people of the town, and it starts to go to the justices or like landowning aristocrats and stuff.
It's really not officially stripped away until 1662, and we don't really have a lot of they are definitely trying to push for that. There's an indication that they were trying to push for that these landowners, these elites were trying to push for more of a say in this local representative. It wasn't official until 1662.
Okay.
There's not evidence that it actually happened much.
Which I guess is a reflection of what you were saying earlier about like how there were different like circumstances with which a constable would be elected.
Right. And it was a very local process. And again, I think that also aligns with the fact that this position was originally like a village chief, a village leader, not a executive branch of a national government or an arm of the monarchy. It was really a person who was of the community and was selected by the community to serve in these roles. Also, something that was very rare was instances of constables abusing their powers as kingsmen over other village inhabitants. Like I was saying, mostly they were just another guy in the village, and their responsibilities and allegiance were more towards the village, as well as, they had this job for a year where they were the liaison between their community and the government.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are definitely instances where the role and authority of the constable were perhaps misused, or where there was some confusion between their public role as constable and their private role as a member of the community. As an example of this, in Burton-on-Trent in the early 1600s, the constable used his position, quote, to lead some of his neighbors in inflicting a traditional form of village justice on two of the inhabitants, unquote. About 40 villagers broke into the house of a couple who was accused of living and sleeping together without being married. The couple was dragged into the street and subjected to, quote, a noisy procession through the town, their cries of a whore and a knave, accompanied by ringing of cowbells, basins, candlesticks, frying pans, and the sound of a drum. The incident matches other descriptions of rough music or charivaris, I don't know if I pronounced that right, charivaris, in which villagers took it upon themselves to ridicule deviant behavior in their neighbors. But the Burton case passed beyond ridicule to punishment, and the goal was probably to drive the couple from the town, unquote. The constable placed the couple in the stocks, not as part of his official capacity or acting as his office. And therefore, this was an instance of some extrajudicial punishment. And the couple took the constable to court over it. Basically said, he was using the power of his office without acting in his office. And that's where he kind of blurred the lines too far.
Right. Yeah, he definitely blurred the lines too far.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, ultimately, there's not a historical record that indicates that they were as comic as Dogberry. And they were really more in a tough position where they could not serve everybody. One of their large responsibilities that I forgot to mention earlier was tax collecting. None of their neighbors really liked them. And if their neighbors liked them because they weren't collecting taxes, then the monarchy
did not like them because they were not
collecting taxes. So in a difficult position. And I think you, though, have more on the community part and the role that they served within their community.
Yeah. And how Dogberry and also Elbow from Measure for Measure, how Shakespeare represents them and how that aligns with like what you were saying or how it doesn't align with what you were saying. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And you're right. One of the things about the constable, which I didn't realize until doing this research, was that like because their terms were 1 year, they are still a member of the community when that term is over. They go back to living in that village.
A normal person, yeah.
But then during their tenure, they are pulled between two forces, the local community and the monarchy.
It's like being an RA.
Yeah, it is.
Or like something else where it's like you have this duality of like you are going to go back and just be a student.
Yeah. But in the meantime, you have to like do noise checks, like hall checks and rat people out for...
Write up your classmates. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And so my research came from the article Dogberry Hero, Shakespeare's Comic Constables and Their Communal Context by Phoebe S. Spinrad. And so, as I said, I will be looking at Dogberry, who everyone here knows because of the synopsis we've been talking about Much Ado, but also Measure for Measure's Elbow. It's a play that we have not gotten to, but if you're familiar with Measure for Measure, even if you're not familiar, you can see how these two constables, these comic constables, are applicable to this conversation. So one of the most common ways the constable is viewed in like Shakespeare study circles is that it's a satirical commentary on the corruptions in Elizabethan local law enforcement systems, as well as judicial or social systems. And we do see that because a lot of the comedy is in the malapropisms, as well as these characters' inability to articulate charges against a malefactor. And you mentioned bumbling. They bumble, and that, though well-meaning, is seen as being inefficient. Although Spinrad argues that they're not necessarily that inefficient. At the end of the play, Dogberry and Verges break up Don John's plot. Elbow also breaks up what happens in Pompey's alehouse and brings Pompey to justice on charges that actually stick. And so even though these constables, they're not ineffectual, even though they may be in ways inefficient. Before we talk specifically about Dogberry and Elbow, I want to go through some of the historical assumptions about early modern / Elizabethan constables that a lot of people have. One of them is that the system was corrupt, and another was that constables were generally taken from the illiterate and stupid commons, which you mentioned that
Wasn't
as well
true.
was not true. And as well, another one that you mentioned, which is not true, is that these people are substitutes for more qualified individuals who want to pay off a person so that they don't have to serve this role. So those are some misconceptions. As you said, constables were normally elected by neighbors in the village, and eligibility was based on residence. So it was not about income or class. And I mean, in some ways, that's kind of not true because having a residence, having a household or a tenement does like
put you in a certain... I think that sort of idea of like it's not based on class feels like a very British sense of class. Like it's not, you weren't a lord, you weren't a member of the landed gentry, you were part of this like new merchant class that, like I said, like they were still prominent members of their community. They just weren't given land and titles by the monarch.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Which really roots them in their community.
Right.
And in most stable populations, that meant that the constable was a neighbor or a settled member. And then there were some populations where the community was more mobile. And so there was like more selling of like buildings and tenements. And so maybe there were constables who were strangers, but generally the people that were serving this position lived either from birth or for a long time in these communities. Mm-hmm. And you said that it's a 1-year office, and this office was supposed to be rotated. And Elbow actually has a tenure of 7.5 years. And so like that could be a commentary on like if there's abuse of a system. I'm going to quote from Measure for Measure, a conversation between Aeschylus and Elbow. Aeschylus says, "Alas, it hath been great pains to you. They do you wrong to put you so oft upon it. Are there not men in your ward sufficient to serve it?" And Elbow says, "Faith, sir, few of any wit in such matters. As they are chosen, they are glad to choose me for them. I do it for some piece of money and go through with all." And Aeschylus says, "Look, you bring me in the names of some 6 or 7, the most sufficient of your parish." And so in this instance, technically Elbow is exceeding his duration. He's been selected to continue every year.
Yeah. Every year the eligible men get together and they're like, "We're voting for you again." He keeps drawing the short stick.
Yes, exactly. And the constabulary duty was actually expensive and time consuming. So it's a position of power, but it is a more draining position of power than say being like a landed gentry.
Yeah.
So that was how Elbow was elected.
Yeah, and he says also that like he does it for some money, and it's like that could maybe hint that like his peers are like, "We will pay you so that we don't have to do this because we just don't want the responsibility."
Yeah.
Yeah.
So for Elbow, it might be like a corrupt system that Shakespeare has written into like his election.
At least a system that's not working as it's supposed to.
Yeah, that's a better way to put it. A system that's not working how it's supposed to.
Yeah.
But Dogberry was elected in the standard way, and he is like seen as a man of some substance in Messina, and he tells Conrad, "I am a wise fellow, and which is more, an officer, and which is more, a householder, and which is more, as pretty a piece of flesh as any is in Messina, and one that knows the law, go to, and a rich fellow enough, go to, and a fellow that hath had losses, and one that hath 2 gowns and everything handsome about him." So he's a, householder who was elected in the town.
Yeah. He is not of the meanest sort. He is certainly below Leonardo and
Don Pedro.
Certainly below Don Pedro's status.
Yeah.
He is certainly the lowest in like one of the lower status in that play, but he's not low status.
Yeah.
In Messina.
Absolutely.
In the broader Messina culture. Yeah.
Exactly. And Dogberry's knowledge of the law is actually not as faulty as it might appear on the surface. So, for example, he picks deputies who can read and write. He quotes the grand jury of the time, and he accepts responsibility, one of those being like, "Call me out of bed if you need me, if something's going on." So he does actually like understand the duties of the constable within the context of Messina.
Mm-hmm.
And while he is illiterate, literacy is not synonymous with stupidity.
Mm-hmm.
And literacy levels, literacy levels among constables varied, sometimes as low as 15% and sometimes as high as 80%. And so when a constable was illiterate, those illiterate constables would have neighbors fill out paperwork for them, as Dogberry does.
He calls the sexton to write everything down.
Yeah.
Part of my reading also, briefly talked about how these men would also serve in like church positions, and the sexton is another member of the community who happens to hold a position within the local parish, who he's going to,
because he can read and write, and Dogberry can't. So he appoints someone to do this. And also, Dogberry's literate deputies obey his orders. So he is respected in this constable position. Mm-hmm. Even if he uses malapropisms and bumbles a little bit, he still does have like people who follow orders and listen to him. Mm-hmm. And Dogberry's performance of duty amongst the chain of command seems to be conscientious. So when Shakespeare is writing this, his chain of command for Dogberry seems to be conscientious of the layers of authority within early modern England. The chain of command for a petty constable was a multiplex and sometimes confusing one, where you report to high constables, sheriffs, bailiffs, justices, royal visitors. Sometimes constables traveled long distances to make their presentments at leet courts, which is what you mentioned, that like medieval court system that sometimes still existed, as well as going to assizes, which is a civil or criminal court case to testify. Mm-hmm. And then on top of that, Dogberry invokes the prince's name, so he understands his bureaucratic channel.
Yes.
So that was the chain of command. And then constables also received a small stipend for the performance of these duties, but it was rarely enough to cover immediate expenses, which is why perhaps Elbow is a substitute who's being compensated by other members of the community who are like, I don't want this job that doesn't pay much, that has too many demands, that's time consuming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or his line could also just refer to that small fee that he's paid.
Or that too.
Yeah.
It's up for interpretation whether or not he's just a good constable who keeps getting elected, or if he is substituting for other members of the community who don't want to take on the responsibility.
Mm-hmm. If he's literally the only guy who's willing to do it.
Exactly. Exactly. And the constable was responsible for hiring his own deputies and maintaining local jail facilities or housing suspects if there was no jail available. He also traveled to assizes, those civil or criminal court cases, at his own expense. If he was reimbursed, he still had to advance the money. And in addition, during that year that a constable is responsible for these community duties, their own business would have to be neglected, or he had to hire assistants to carry on his business during his absence.
Wow.
So it was very time-consuming, very expensive to be a constable. And constable duties could also be dangerous. Criminals were not always as docile as Borachio, Conrad, Pompey, and Froth. And sometimes a constable wouldn't have enough assistants. Additionally, sometimes a constable's assistants were the ones that he had to arrest. And as you mentioned earlier, there are many cases on record of a constable being assaulted by his own townspeople during his attempts to search a house, break up a fight, collect unpopular assessment, close down an illegal alehouse, or stop a popular local crime. So if the local townspeople were not happy with the performance of the constable's duties, they might turn on the constable.
Yeah. Like I said, that tension of if the village was not a fan of something that came from the king or queen, they would get mad at the constable.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm going into next is the constable's push and pull between loyalty to community and responsibility to his superiors and the central government. And one aspect of that we see in Much Ado is vagrancy acts, vagrancy laws. So Dogberry's instructions on dealing with town vagrants is this. He says to the watch, "This is your charge. You shall comprehend all vagrom men. You are to bid any man to stand in the prince's name." And the second watch says, "How if it will not stand?" And Dogberry says, "Why then, take no note of him, but let him go. And presently call the rest of the watch together, and thank God you are rid of a knave." And Verges says, "If he will not stand when he is bidden, he is none of the prince's subjects." And this inclusion of vagrancy acts, vagrancy laws, or the problem of the vagrant is really specific to that time period where vagrancy was a growing problem in England throughout the 16th century. By statutory definition, quote, "A vagrant was a person able to labor who possessed neither land nor master, who worked at no recognized trade, and who refused to accept such employment as might be offered to him. Almost invariably, this meant working as a servant in husbandry or agricultural laborer," unquote. And during this time period, a lot of the men that were landless or masterless were landless or masterless due to land enclosures and the new entering of wage industries in the towns. And so they did not have employment and would go from town to town searching for employment, but usually found in those new towns that there was no employment. And so they might turn to robbery, or assault is something that Spinrad mentions, but I don't know about any specifics of that. And this was a problem for the towns in terms of they had a system of poor relief, but the vagrant technically didn't qualify for the poor relief.
Yeah. We kind of talked about the systems of poor relief in our King Lear series of how London, for example, had a separate house for the poor who could not help themselves. And they were quite proud of being able to help those who could not work and were poor. And then there was a separate institution for people who were deemed able to work but weren't working. So vagrant. Those would be the vagrants. And in London, it was an early version of a workhouse. We're going to employ you then.
Yeah, exactly. And in many of these cases, I mean, the members of society that were considered vagrants, they're not a monolith, but many of them were vagrants because there was no work available. And so this was a growing problem for Elizabethan and early modern England. And so then the monarch the central government, passed two different vagrancy acts. One of them, the Vagrancy Act of 1572, essentially like punished first-time offenders through imprisonment, whipping, and branding. And then second-time offenders were ruled as felons, and anyone who tried to escape were hanged. And then that intensified in 1579, where vagrants were to be whipped from town to their legal parish. And then the last town had to assume the cost of his support. So you just got whipped until you ended up at the end of the road.
Wow.
And constables were the ones that did the whipping. And so Dogberry's instructions to the watch might actually be seen not as like neglect or ineffectiveness, but rather having good sense or mercy.
Mm-hmm. Just let him go. He's going to go to the next town anyway. We don't need to inflict harm, is what he might be saying. Yeah.
Exactly. So in this instance, this might be a very, very kind thing, which Fergus suggests.
Yeah.
And that sentiment is unlike the general Elizabethan population's view of physical punishment. Dogberry does not want to resort to physical punishment, and that was a very desensitized act for the Elizabethan population. Dogberry says, "Truly, I would not hang a dog by my will, much more a man that hath any honesty in him."
Mm-hmm.
And Elizabeth in 1582 actually ordered a sweep of vagrants that swept up several hundred vagrants during the course of, I think, like 10 days.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, for the central government, the monarchy, like, vagrants were seen as this very big problem, and the solution was to inflict harm. Dogberry chooses to not do this. And he's not the only one. There were constables who were charged with neglect of duty by the Leet Court for failing to apprehend vagrants or allowing the escape of prisoners. So this like live and let live attitude resulted in massive fines for constables if they chose to do that. They chose to let them go.
Like you were saying, a kind, merciful act to be like, I would rather be fined than like inflict harm on another human being just because it's the law. Mm-hmm. Just because like the law says that we should sweep vagrants. I'm just not going to do it, is an act of resistance, possibly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so maybe some of these things that he chooses to not do, maybe some of these quote unquote inefficient choices of enforcing rules and regulations in the town is not a neglect of duty, but rather like community care.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe some sort of radical resistance against an unjust system.
Mm-hmm.
Whoa.
I love it. Yeah. And this is where ACAB comes in. All constables aren't Dogberry, unfortunately. I'll give Elyse credit for that. That was Elyse. But either way, even though there are these acts that are potentially like a neglect of duty, Dogberry's men, and Elbow do act in real trouble. So, for example, when Dogberry's men overhear Borachio and Conrad, they make an immediate arrest. And then in addition, Elbow does also neglect his duty when it comes to like enforcing alehouse laws, because instead of raiding and arresting, he allows the poor people who work in the alehouse a source of income, and he also allows these people refuge from the vagrancy acts. So he also does neglect his duty, but against the vagrancy acts. In addition, Elbow's apprehension of Pompey and Froth saved his pregnant wife from dangerous men, and so Spinrad argues that in both cases, in Much Ado with Dogberry and Measure for Measure with Elbow, the official system has been ineffectual while the individual community system has worked. So Dogberry and Elbow see what is going on and they preserve the well-being of the community. In these plays, Shakespeare presents a sort of self-protecting community that is a counter-agent against this idea that there's too much official enforcement in the village as well as too little official enforcement in the cities, like in London. Mm-hmm. And actually, the Dogberryan method of enforcement was favored in Stratford. Quote, "A document such as the Warwickshire Recusancy Return of 1592 is a record of the coercive power of the Tudor state, extending itself into every parish, affecting the lives of very ordinary subjects of the town. One natural reaction to such governmental meddling was to find various ways of being as little affected as possible, and it is not surprising that in many parishes there are signs that local officers did not like to push the penal laws too hard against their friends and neighbors. In Stratford in 1592, the wardens seem to have responded to the letter of the law and no more," unquote. Like much of this penal law pressure was enforced from outside of the community.
Yeah, like I spoke to, there was, there were definitely instances where like the community banded together because somebody was doing something wrong. But it was like, this is the community's job to police behavior, not the government and the churches.
And Shakespeare in many ways does build into these two respective cities of Messina and Vienna, both sides of the coin, where Messina is the stable communal society and Vienna has like danger in the streets. But to wrap it all up, I think that Dogberry and Elbow are two characters who are responding to the very real concerns Elizabethans had regarding community safety, government oversight, and like the need for community care.
Mm-hmm.
And Spinrad sums this up that like both Dogberry and Elbow, even though they can barely be understood by officialdom does not understand a number of things about local conditions, things that Dogberry and Elbow understand very well.
Mm-hmm.
So even though these two comic constables are inefficient, they are at the end effectual. Yeah.
And like you said, like I think it's a perfect example to compare, because we have the class difference in Much Ado that we've talked about, that Dogberry and the Watch and Verges, they're the ones who are able to figure out what Don John's doing and bring forth the law. And meanwhile, Claudio and Don Pedro witness the trick and are completely fooled by it into making some wild accusations at Hero.
Yeah, and destroying her life, essentially.
And it's a really interesting thing to think about it through a lens of what if Dogberry, while, he is certainly, a comic character and was played by a clown, and what if they are actually effective at their jobs because they know their community and they know they like know that like Margaret would act this way and Hero would act this way, and they, are paying attention to to Baraccio and Conrad, looking at it through a lens of like, actually, they are way more effective and noble in their acts than Don Pedro and Claudio.
Yeah. And perhaps it is classist to think that people of a lower status are merely stupid. Yeah.
Wow, what does that sound like?
Mm-hmm.
That sounds like the authorship debate.
Absolutely.
Which, again, not a debate.
No. But, I mean, it's something that Shakespeare grew up with a father who was owned his own business and served the community. And granted, John Shakespeare left in shame in some ways from his position. But, it could be something that was on his mind as a person who experienced a community like that. Yeah.
And who also was, not of a elite class when he came to London. He wasn't educated the same way that Marlowe was. He wasn't in the same circles to begin with as his contemporaries and the people who became his peers. And it's really interesting to think about these depictions as not punching down, but rather maybe being like, yeah, so what if I don't talk perfectly?
Yeah.
So what if, just because somebody is from somewhere, or didn't have the same access to things that Don Pedro did, doesn't mean that they are less than.
Yes. And just because Dogberry doesn't always use the words correctly, he knows what his duties are. He knows what the words and responsibilities mean.
Even though he's not using the right words, he knows the intent, not the letter of the law. I
think that's a good place to wrap it.
I think so too. And with that, thank you for listening.
I'm Kourtney Smith.
And I'm Elyse Sharp.
This is Shakespeare Anyone.
Thank you so much for listening to Shakespeare Anyone. Works referenced in this episode are available in the episode description. Our theme music is Neverending Minute by Sounds Like Sander. If you would like to support us, it would help us out if you would hit the subscribe button, like us, leave a comment, write a review, share us on social media, tell a friend about us, all the things. We'd appreciate it.
You can also support the podcast at patreon.com/Shakespeare Anyone.
Patreon patrons get access to exclusive bonus content throughout the year. The link is also in the episode description.
For more, you can visit our website, shakespeareanyone.com, Follow us on Instagram at Shakespeare Anyone Pod or Twitter at Shakespeare Anyone. For Twitter, that's Shakespeare Any and the number 1. Every other platform is spelled out like the name of the podcast.
Now, because you listened all the way to the end of the credits, here's a completely random Shakespeare quote for you.
From Antony and Cleopatra, Act 5, Scene 2, said by Cleopatra. This is the brief of money, plate, and jewels I am possessed of.